Good afternoon and welcome to today's Trinity Talks event, co-presented with WNYC. My name is LaFontaine Oliver and I have the absolute pleasure of serving this community as the president and CEO of New York Public Radio. And I am thrilled to be partnering with Trinity Church for this important conversation and thrilled to be in this historic space. St. Paul's Chapel has witnessed a lot of history, as you know. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington took the oath of office to become the first president of the United States at Federal Hall on Wall Street. Then he walked down the road right into this very space to attend a worship service. It was a turning point for our country and for the world, a moment that marked the beginning of this great American experience. As you know, we will hear from Frank Bruni, author of the new book, The Age of Grievance. Frank has been a journalist for more than 3 decades, including over 25 years at the Times. In 2021, he became a professor at Duke University, teaching in the School of Public Policy. He writes a popular weekly newsletter for the Times and produces additional essays as one of the paper's contributing opinion writers. Joining him is the Reverend Phillip Jackson, the 19th rector of Trinity Church and the spiritual leader of this parish. Before coming to Trinity, Phil served parishes in Arizona, Texas, and Michigan. Before that, he was an attorney. Before we get started, I'd like to remind the audience that there will be time for questions. If you'd like to submit a question, please text the number, hopefully on your screens. And I would remind you to please also keep your phones silent. There's not much going on in the world today. You can put, my phone's blowing up. Frank and Phil, please join me on the stage. Thank you all for being here, and please enjoy the conversation.
What's he talking about?
Yeah, did something happen in the news today? Yeah.
Well, Frank, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome
Thanks
to
for having
Trinity Church. It's a pleasure to have you. Let's go right there. Talk about what just happened, a little context, your thoughts, your feelings. What should we know? By the way, we did not plan this. We had no idea this was going to happen. So, and that we happen to be right here.
But as the Reverend knows, I just spent much of the last hour in the green room finishing a column that's already online at the time on the Times' website. No, that's not it. I wish that was a joke. So I'm a little frazzled. So you're gonna have to be gentle with me. No, I mean I think we're probably seeing it right now. If we were tuned into the news, I think you're gonna see grievance culture on steroids over the next couple of hours and days. I think you're going to see, well, we know what we're going to see. Right. We just don't know the exact form and details, but I think you're going to see a big chunk of this country, big chunk of the electorate, reject what just happened, see it as the result of a completely biased and corrupt system. Donald Trump has laid the groundwork for that for years. I mean, the Trump political project has been about many things, one of which is inoculating himself from a chapter like this. So I mean, I'm fascinated to see how well that works. You know, there were voter surveys, opinion polls over recent months that suggested that a small but potentially consequential percentage of his supporters would abandon him if he were convicted, and now he's been convicted of all 34 counts. I'm not so sure I see that happening, because when I look at the country, and that's the reason I wrote this book, I see most people dug into a perspective that forces are arrayed against them, that those forces are not just or fair, and they kind of measure their lots in life by how they've been wronged, by how badly they've been wronged, and by who's wronged them. And unfortunately, this narrative is going to graft very neatly onto that.
Yeah, this is almost tailor-made for the book, and that sense of grievance that you described so well. Anything else? And we're going to take questions if you have anything. But anything else you want to add on this this thing that has just happened?
Well, I mean, I worry. I worry as I have, up until this moment, that it's going to be just profoundly and bitterly divisive,
Yes.
and that what will get lost in all of this is that Donald Trump was treated to all of the kind of rights and perks, whatever you want to call them, of a justice system. I mean, in fact, there are, these were 34 the counts against him. There are 3 other cases and scores more.
Right.
This is the only trial, the only prosecution that will probably reach a conclusion before Election Day. Yeah. And that's because, in fact, if you are someone like Trump, if you have money and influence, you can do things like appeal and delay. So he is not the victim of a judicial system run amok. He has been given all the kinds of rights and all of that a citizen receives. But I really fear that is going to get lost on too many Americans.
Let me ask you, Frank, just before we get into the main part. Actually, I think it was in this very church. I preached a sermon after Election Day, the Sunday after Election Day in 2016. I suggested that one of the biggest problems that his election would bring would be a corrosiveness, and we have seen that, I think, in many different areas. How does that resonate with you at all?
Well, he hasn't. I mean, his campaign in 2016, and then again in 2020, was unlike the campaigns of the presidents who preceded him. I covered for the Times George W. Bush's presidential campaign. Whether you thought the words were hot air or not, one of his slogans was, "I'm a uniter, not a divider." Right? Now, whether he lived up to that or not, but he saw a currency in saying to the electorate, "I want to bring us together."
Right.
Whether they were empty words or not. He saw currency in that, and that was consistent with what he believed was the kind of public leadership you were supposed to exhibit, right? Then, of course, you had Obama, hope and change. I mean, successful candidate after successful candidate, whether they meant it or not, said, "I'm appealing to your better angels."
Right.
And again, they thought that was the way to go. That's not what Trump did in 2016. He did even less so in 2020. And he came out of the gate this time around, saying literally verbatim to voters, "I am your retribution." Right. It's us versus them, and the way you torture them, the way you own the libs, the way you make them squirm, is you elect me, they hate me, and then we cackle and we take our revenge. Right. That is such a perversion and inversion of what political leadership was always supposed to be, and how it was seen by the people who campaigned for the Oval Office before him.
That's a fascinating and sort of apropos lead-in to the book. Let's talk about the book. Because the idea that presidential narrative was able to shift like that and gain currency, and around this idea you have of grievance. Why was it just Trump that made you see that? Was it what led to this book? What sort of brought it to bear this, what you call, I love it, sort of the primacy of grievance in our country today?
It's not just Trump, and we're talking about him, cutting a kind of public figure and articulating a message that is different and darker and more negative. The fact that he was elected, yes, he didn't win the popular vote. Yes, it was only by, 75,000 votes in 3 key states. Right. Nonetheless, it meant he won a lot of support. That would not have happened if he wasn't articulating something that resonated with people, right? Yeah. He is both an accelerant of our grievance and he's the fruit of it. He's a reflection of it. Yeah. Something happened and has been happening in American life for a while, I think especially since 2008, and we can talk about why I think 2008 is a big turning point, where more and more people, and across the political spectrum, that's what I find so interesting about it. This is not a partisan phenomenon, this is a supra or pan-partisan phenomenon. More and more people, their political engagement, their cultural discussions begin with and are based on, how have I been slighted? How have I been wronged? Who's responsible for it? Who's on my team? Who's not on my team? How do we win? and how do we kind of consign them to the margins forevermore? I mean, you see this when people are polled today versus 15, 20 years ago about how they regard their adversaries on the opposite side of the aisle, how Republicans regard Democrats and vice versa. It's no longer, these are people who disagree with me.
Right.
These are people who are misguided. These are people who are immoral.
These
are people who are threats to the country. These are people who are evil.
Right.
That's not normal, and that's not what things were like 30, 40, 50 years ago. I mean, to some extent, yes, this has always existed, but not in as pervasive and profound a fashion as it does now. It's in the last several decades that the phrase negative partisanship kind of got currency and drew a lot of scrutiny and study. We're now beyond negative partisanship to what I call in the book apocalyptic partisanship. There is this sense that if I and my tribe don't prevail, it's the end of days.
Right.
And that makes this a really, really difficult country to govern.
Right. What happened in '08? Talk about '08.
Well, I mean, again, '08 is just, I think, a point where this sped up, where this intensified. But I think it's been building toward this. But I think, by 2008, you have the internet and the social media reaching a point of maturation. In 2008, you have the near collapse of the global economy, right? And then you have the fixes to that and the recovery from that. And what happened was, in terms of American income inequality, in terms of a sense that the economic playing field was not even remotely fair or even, the way in which people came out of 2008 and 2009, I think really exacerbated tensions and really turbocharged the narrative that there are insiders who are always on a glide path, and have protections and privileges, and then there are the outsiders. After that, you have the Tea Party, which is very much the precursor to the MAGA movement. But all of this is happening as more and more people are hopping online, as the social media platforms are maturing and becoming ubiquitous. And as the media environment changes, the whole landscape, we're living, when people say, and they often do, well, we've had bitterly fractious moments before, and everything was just fine. What we didn't have then was an information landscape, and a media ecosystem in which each of us can kind of filter and curate a bespoke truth that is just ours. And when we then have public disagreements, when we then have public discussions, we have every single person who's involved in that discussion has his, her, or their own version of the facts and own version of the truth.
Right.
That's not something we've been up against before, and I don't think we've come close to figuring out how we deal with that so that we have a common narrative that allows us to establish common ground.
It's excellent. There are a couple things there that I want to unpack further. We'll get to it, but I want to talk about common narratives. I think that's a very important, actually it may be the salient solution, I think, ultimately. You have some good ones and some good thoughts on that. I want to ask you a little bit about just take a step back. So we have these two opposites, these two poles, as it were. Could you describe for everyone, could you describe the two worldviews, if you could, of both of those?
Well, if we're simplifying and kind of reducing it to that sort of two, which is a little, but yes, I know what you're saying. What's interesting is with different degrees of justification and with different consequences that I don't think you can say there's an equivalence to the threat posed. But there's a sort of neat mirror image. If you look at the most impassioned and furious people on the left, they believe that the world is arranged in a way that does sustained and regular injustice to them, that they cannot get a fair shake, that their adversaries are not just ignorant and not just kind of passively uncaring of what's going on, but are bitterly
active
against them.
Mm-hmm.
And that this is a battle, and to see it as anything less is to be a blissful fool, right? If you look at the MAGA movement, I've just described that to a T.
Right.
They believe that this corrupt liberal establishment condescends to them, looks down on them, is deliberately trying to shove them to the margins of American life, and that if they don't fight back in every way possible, with every means they have, even if some of them are ugly, they are being blissful fools, and they are going to be consigned to permanent oppression. It's the same exact orientation to and take on the world. It just reaches opposite conclusions about who the oppressors are and who's in charge.
Right.
And I want to hasten to say something, because when one says something like that, immediately people say, isn't that both sidesism? Isn't that a false equivalence? That dynamic can exist across the political and ideological spectrum, and one can note that, and it doesn't mean they represent an equivalent threat in both places,
right,
or they've taken hold in the same way. Organized political violence, much more pronounced and pervasive on the right, right? So one has to acknowledge that. Election denialism, obviously much more pervasive and pronounced on the political right. It was not the left, it was the right that stormed the US Capitol on January 6th.
Right.
So I'm not saying there's an equivalence here, but I'm saying there are psychological forces, there are sort of political dynamics that are quasi-universal. Yeah.
Are quite similar. I think, especially in the way things have broken down, where there are blue and red, and New York is obviously a blue state, and New York City is super blue of that. I think one of the things I'd like to ask you to think about or talk to us about is, in what ways do we fail to see ourselves in the other?
In countless ways. I mean, I don't know if this is a direct answer to your question, but I think so much of the way we talk these days, so much of the way in which politicians appeal to us, actually kind of tuck us into categories, as opposed to emphasizing what we have in common, right? And the media does this too. I can't count the number of times a political candidacy has begun, a political candidate has come out on the stage in a big way for the first time. And you'll see on TV, you'll see in newspapers, in the New York Times, as the stories are being written about this person, here's what about this person's biography, platform, et cetera, may or may not appeal to black voters. Here's what may or may not appeal to LGBTQ voters. Here's what may or may not work with Latino voters, right? The minute the assignment desk sort of does that, you're sending the message and you're buying into the notion that we vote our identities, that our identities are primarily defined by such demographic factors, and that we kind of live out and vote them, and you're denying what I think is the complexity of most people, and you're also sending a message, which I don't think you mean to, that we all have these individual and individuated interests, and that those are in the foreground as opposed to what are our common interests. It's interesting, there was, I don't know how many of you read the Times' morning newsletter, which I strongly recommend, and if you're Times subscribers, it's the one newsletter that is sent to everyone. Unfortunately, the rest of us with newsletters, we have to get you to buy in, like they don't just send us out until you cancel us, right? But it's a great product, and I was reading it this morning, it gave me a lot of hope. Because it was showing that, in contrast to what gets attention on social media, in contrast to the sort of assignment desk approach to many political campaigns and candidates that I just mentioned, when you ask people what's most important to them, most of the answers are matters that are quite universal. They're not, Israel-Gaza was way down the list, right?
Inflation
affects everybody. The economy affects everybody. Public order affects everybody, right? That same newsletter also showed, I've been talking about the way in which way too many people on the right and left behave. And it's a big enough number of people that I think it's worthy of, not only worthy, it has to be discussed, and it's the reason I look into it in the book. But there remains a significant portion of the American electorate that actually is looking for harmony, is looking for bipartisanship. And there was a fascinating section of this morning's newsletter, which is another reason I recommend it, that was talking about how if you look at the successful Senate candidates, at least going by polls right now, in purple states, they are talking about bipartisanship, they are sounding conciliatory notes, they sound nothing like Twitter. And that's how they're finding their success, which tells you that for as far as we've fallen, there really remains a market for something cooler, something calmer, something more deliberative, and something more collective.
Don't you, do you ever hear these in the papers sometimes, or other places I've read, where they say, they ask kids, if you could get offline, would you? And they say yes. Yeah. And then they say, well, but your friends won't be. They say, well, then I got to stay.
Right.
Is that, have you seen those?
Yeah, I mean, I have, but asking them to get offline, I mean, it's sort of like asking them to stop eating. I mean, it's just, no, I mean, it's wherever, I mean, they can't function without it. It's where, I mean, it is the conduit for the information they need, along with all the poison that they don't need to ingest, right?
Right.
I mean, it's all mixed together there. So asking them to get offline or wondering if we can get them offline, I think is just foolish, because it's minutes spent instead of what we need to be doing, which is how do we change their online lives?
Yeah.
And I think it's possible because I've been a professor at Duke for 3 years now. So I've taught hundreds of students in a range of different classes. And it comes up in almost every class, social media, how you use it, et cetera. And without fail, what I learn from my students when we have these discussions is that like literally zero of them, none of them, set up an online life, set up a social media, set up social media feeds, bookmarks, whatever you want to talk about the construction of your online life. None of them sat there and said, what kind of online life do I want?
Right.
What is the menu of information I want to have available to me? And let me make sure that I set everything up in alignment with my goals and my interests. They started following a few things. They looked to their left, they looked to their right, and I don't mean political, I mean the people sitting next to them. They followed them, the algorithms kicked in, and if you ask them to pause and to look at what's coming into their inboxes, metaphorically speaking, every minute, every hour, and to think about whether it's really best for them and it's what they want, they're like, no. And they start to kind of think, well, how did I get here? And you can get them to make adjustments. I don't see us as a society with young people who are not, one would assume not entirely set in their ways. I don't see us at enough junctures with enough earnestness and with enough energy asking them to think about the nature of their online lives, to think about whether the way they spend time online and what they're exposed to is aligned with who they want to be, and asking them to change it. And I think it's possible, but I think it has to begin at a fairly early age, and it needs to be sustained, not just 10 minutes in one of my classes.
Right. I think your description of how they come to their sort of internet online life, certainly that's not true for us adults.
But I was teaching when October 7th happened. I'll give you an example. I'd volunteered to teach a first-year seminar because I hadn't been, first-year students hadn't been getting into my classes, and I wanted to teach some first-year students. And over the weeks after that, we talked a bunch about what happened. And a lot of the students said, and it was a kind of it was an effect of social media that I hadn't fully grappled with because, like everyone else, I was so concerned with algorithms and echo chambers and that sort of stuff. But they kind of felt they knew something monumental, something usually historic had happened, something monstrous. And they felt like if they didn't put something online, if they didn't Instagram or TikTok or whatever their chosen platform, if they didn't note it in some fashion, it would look like they were tuned out and they were a loser. But then what to say, right? So they basically looked for which of their peer group, which of their friends had posted something, and they reposted that. And then they did that again. Then, and they admitted this once we had this kind of open conversation, then they were invested in making sure a viewpoint that was really a conjecture was correct. And so they started looking for information that affirmed that their kind of hasty position they took was not one that was taken in error. And so you can see how something that was not considered, something that was not the product of let me wait and get a bunch of information, let me process this and figure out what I believe, how a much more kind of visceral peer group reaction becomes a viewpoint that you're suddenly committed to, and the next thing you know, you're in an encampment. And your road there was not one of robust, roving intellectual inquiry. It was something else, and it was something facilitated by this very dangerous dynamic of social media.
Wow. Of course, again, adults Not, it doesn't happen at all like that. So the first move is, what are my friends doing and saying? That's the first move.
Yeah, and we all do that in our lives in a million ways, whether it's what we're serving at a dinner party or whether it's what movie we're going to see. But when you're doing it with your political views at such a young and impressionable age, that's a bit scarier.
Yeah.
That's a bit scarier than, oh, everyone's serving quiche, so I guess that's my appetizer.
Right.
You know?
Do you get the sense?
Just to go back to the 80s and really date myself. You know? We can talk about basil pesto next, yeah.
Hey now, hey, come on.
Oh,
That's
no,
good.
I'm a pesto
That's
fan.
good.
Yeah. There is no pesto polarization here. No.
I want to ask you, get into the book a little bit. I loved your chapter on expectations, zombies, and American decline. Could you talk a little bit about that? I love the zombies thing. The zombies thing is spot on.
Well, I had some fun with zombies. Well, I say that every era gets this sort of monster.
Right,
You know, it
that they deserve.
And, I mean, and those of us who took literature classes in college remember how Frankenstein was, you know, the kind of
Science.
emblemized all the anxieties of industrialization and all of that. You know, we have zombies.
We got zombies.
And as someone much smarter than I am said, and I put it in the book because it was such a good line, that you know, AMC, the cable network, has basically simply become a zombie delivery system, you know, with like 10 versions of The Walking Dead. You know, Fear the Walking Dead. I mean, soon it's going to be When the Walking Dead Drive. I mean, it's like any iteration they can come up with. But the kind of the non-pop culture part of that chapter is one of the forces that really fuels grievance is a whole new American pessimism that I'm not sure we always recognize or fully reckon with. Right. America has always been seen as, and has always seen itself as, a singularly optimistic country. And that's always been oversimplified. But I think it is fundamentally true, and I think it's an important, you know, part of the American psyche. We're not that way anymore. You know, I mean, surveys, it used to be that when you asked people, do you think your children will have a better life than you will? And people always heard that, sadly, as economically, and economics aren't everything. But you know, it was not hard to get a majority of people. It was more the norm than the exception that a majority of people said, yes, that's what I assume. You cannot take that for granted anymore. It's actually kind of the opposite. Gallup, for many, many decades now, Gallup several times a year has asked the same question and has asked Americans, are you generally satisfied, you know, with this country or the way things are going in this country? I forget the exact language, but the generally satisfied thing is correct. Mm-hmm. I mean, up until 2004, you know, you would have years or moments within years where generally satisfied would be more than 60% of people, more than 65% of people. It would go up and down, and it would very, very frequently be over 50%. Mm-hmm. 2004 to now, that's 20 years, it has never hit or crested 50%. Wow. The question is, will it be as low as 11%, which is what it was shortly after the January 6, 2021 riots, you know, or will it maybe get into the low 40s? Mm. That's an enormous change in the psychology of the country. And what happens when you no longer trust in growth, when you no longer believe the frontier is endless, you know, that tomorrow is or could be a whole lot brighter than today and yesterday, you have a completely different relationship to the citizens around you. Yeah. It's less collaborative, it's more competitive. Right. Your thinking is zero-sum thinking. If that person is getting something, I'm losing something. Right. And you hear that phraseology all the time in our political discussions. Oh, yeah. You know, if a politician is saying we need to do better by this group, that is heard by certain as voters as something's going to be taken away from me. Right. This idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, that is not where we are anymore. And that is an enormous accelerant of grievance.
And you know, you're suggesting that that's across the spectrum.
Yes. Well, I mean, interestingly, and a lot's been written about this recently in certain contexts, I think left of center, you see more pessimism than right of center.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Any thoughts on why?
I mean, I'll show my political bias here a little bit. I mean, I'm left of center. I'm not far left of center, and there's plenty of criticism in the book about people who I think are extreme on the left. But so I'm going to be a little bit biased and glib and say oh, maybe we're realistic. We're more realistic.
Oh.
I don't know. I mean, I think there is, for a whole bunch of reasons, I think left of center, there is a willingness to see would be the nice way to put it. A fixation on it might be the wrong way to put it. Where all the imperfections are and where we've fallen far short of our ideals and our promises. Maybe, but I don't know.
No, go on. Well, you just made me think of this idea that we have fallen short of our promises is a pretty regnant idea right now. Certainly much more so than when I was a kid, when you were a kid, and that the country we've heard it described as fundamentally founded in slavery or corruption or da-da-da-da-da. I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the loss of common narrative. How do we, is that something we should just say goodbye to? Is it something that is necessary to sort of bind the body politic, the body social together? Is it something we can bring back? What do you think?
Well, I don't think we can bring it back to the extent that we had it before, just because
we know
our cultural intake is so much more diverse, and our consumption of culture is so much more fractured.
Right.
You know what I mean? You say to a young person today that something was a water cooler show, and they don't know what you're talking about, not just because the water cooler is a fossil, but because the idea that everybody
watched that.
But here's, I'm going to kind of pivot from answering your question to something that's in the same universe. But I think we're really, I don't know how we bring it back, but I think we're hungry for it, right? If you look at the Taylor Swift phenomenon, her concerts, right? What has happened? I mean, the magnitude of attention and success that she achieved over the last couple of years, and how squarely and fully in the foreground of everyone's consciousness she was. Yes, that's because she's talented, but there are a lot of talented people. I heard young people talking about her. I heard older people talking about her. I heard people of all races talking about her. I heard people, on various rungs of the economic ladder talking about her. And I think it built and fed on itself because I think people were enjoying being able to have a conversation that everyone was plugged into. I think she benefited in a big way from people's hunger to have a common point of reference and something that everyone was familiar with, and a language, a vocabulary that everybody was up on.
Could share.
I think she benefited from that. I think it's one of the reasons why you'll go the whole year and most Americans can't tell you like who's in which football conference or division, or who's bound for the Super Bowl. But the Super Bowl comes around and posts numbers like no other TV event. And that's because everyone is so excited about this opportunity, because they're so rare, to be on the same page for just a few hours and to be able to have conversations across differences. So we want that common narrative. I'm not sure how we get it, but you said something earlier I just want to kind of flash back to.
Sure.
When you're talking about expectations, I think it's worth always reminding ourselves and remembering the things that make this country so great are also things that make this country really hard, right? I think we've seen a magnitude and intensity of grievance in this country, and I think it is a singularly fascinating laboratory for grievance. Because it's a country that makes such big promises, because it's a country that fills people with such high expectations. Right. And we never don't want to do that. We want to do that. Right. But any study of happiness that you look at, people aren't happy or sad in relation to kind of the objective measurement of what they have and don't have in their lives. Right. It's vis-a-vis how their lives are turning out vis-a-vis what they expected, right? There are human beings by nature are tribal. We know this. We see it all over the globe, across every decade of history. We are trying. Our democracy has a scale of diversity that again is unmatched. We can't look back in history and say there was a durable democracy that had our kind of diversity, et cetera. It is a fact that lends credence to that phrase, American experiment. And it is what makes us so special, and it is what should make us so proud. But it's difficult. It's tough. And so as we're making sense of this and trying to pivot to a better place, one thing I wish we would do is recognize that to the extent that we often get things wrong, it's because we're trying something that's not just really important, but that's really difficult and that's unprecedented.
Yeah. You make this great point in the book about expectations that the fact that we can achieve, that we are told that we can achieve, and that if you don't, it's your fault. And when you combine that with a kind of narrative of victimology,
That's right.
then someone must have made that happen.
Yeah.
It can't be because I failed. Someone had to be behind that.
We have a lot of people. We're in a period of time where a lot of people have lives that fall short of expectations, that fall short of the dream, the narrative. We're in a period of time where social mobility is not what it was before, and that's really crucial. So when you are not living that social mobility you've heard so much about, when you're
and
not
seen on
when
your
you're not
feed.
rising, and your choices are to feel like a failure, or to listen to someone, and there are people again across the political spectrum who say, "Oh no, this has nothing to do with you. You have not made a false step. There's no shortfall in your talent or your character. This is about the way in which circumstances are arrayed against you, and so your response should be rage." That is much more emotionally attractive than a more complicated thing.
Right.
And often you didn't blow it, but I
Right.
mean, the healthiest, truest reaction is a complicated one. I've been dealt some bad breaks. Maybe I've made some bad choices. Let me sift through all of this, and to the extent that I can make changes in myself,
Right.
even if they're just because of circumstances that changed in a way that I had no control over, let's do that. It's a lot easier to say, no, I'm going to storm the Capitol.
Right. That's a choice, right? You quote Obama's speech, speaking of expectations, that speech he gave where he points out that things are actually pretty good.
Yeah.
You say something.
Yeah, no, in that same chapter about pessimism and how much more profound American pessimism is right now than people realize, it's also less warranted.
Demonstrably.
It's demonstrably not warranted. I mean, there are all sorts of, we could spend the next weeks on the stage cataloging. There are all sorts of injustices and inequities in American life that I am not saying for a moment we should shrug our shoulders about or throw up our hands. We need to attend to them, and we need to keep finding ways to attend to them that are more effective than the ways we've tried before.
Right.
We also need at moments to step back and realize that by historical measures and in the long view, we are living, even today, with a former president guilty of 34 counts of falsified business record. I'm so used to kind of like all the phrases. You can't just say a hush money scheme. You got to build in the falsified business records and all of that. We're living in a charmed time.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to look back, 2016, right? Last full year of Obama's presidency. He's not campaigning for anything, right? So this is not a speech that is about kind of trying to serve an ambition of his own. And he goes to Hanover, Germany, and he says, look, if you had to choose any moment in history to be alive, you would choose right now. And if you had to choose any place to be alive at that moment in history, you would choose the United States of America. Right. It's a really, really important thing to remember because it's a very necessary hedge against a kind of anger that turns into an overwrought and destructive rage.
Well, I would say I think we would all agree that people are still coming to New York for a reason. Not just because they're getting shipped here from Texas.
People are arriving at the border for a reason.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. People are coming up from other countries, because they want to come here, they still see something that we somehow seem to not see.
So you talk about a common narrative. I don't think we do civics education in schools the way we once did. In fact, in some cases, because it's so fraught, because
Right.
nobody wants to stumble onto a kind of lesson that sounds like an imposed narrative, that seems to be running afoul of some sensitivity.
Right.
We need to make sure that our sensitivity stops shy of hypersensitivity.
Right.
Otherwise we are binding and gagging ourselves in ways that we can't have any conversations at all. We need to have conversations, again, with young people, about what this country has done at its best. Yes, let's talk about our sins. Let's talk about the various ways in which we have and continue to betray our ideals. But let's balance that with a sense of the kind of pride that President Obama was communicating in Hanover, Germany in 2016. I think part of what he was saying is, yes, I've been in the arena now for 8 years as president and longer than that as a political gladiator. But when I take a moment and when I kind of, look with the widest angle and the longest view, I'm proud of this country, and I'm grateful for being here in this country at this moment in time. I think we don't do that often enough.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Frank, I want to, before we get to the Q&A, there are a couple of things I want you just to kind of respond to. The first is, and this is as we sort of go to begin to talk about solutions. I wrote in my notes about identities and the oppression Olympics. I then wrote myself this note to ask you, which is that we have put a tremendous amount of pressure and heightened importance on our various identities. From a theological standpoint, that is the least interesting thing. Those are the least interesting aspects of us from God's perspective. I wonder if you would respond to that.
Well, it's an interesting. I like hearing you say that, because part of what I hear you saying is God sees all of us as human, first and foremost, and none of the rest of it competes with that fact. Now, and we increasingly, as we've talked about tonight, have cultural conversations, political conversations that focus on all the ways in which we are different.
Right.
It's a matter of proportion to a point that is important. When you do have, data and when you do have facts that show that there are aspects of demographic category that end up too much driving people's destinies because of social attitudes, bigotries, prejudices. Yeah, you have to note that, you have to look at it, you have to attend to it.
Right.
But you can get so mired in that that you fail to see all of the connective tissue and the common humanity. And I feel like we don't have the right proportion right now.
Yeah.
What I worry about even more, though, is the number of people, and I think I refer to them in the book as grievance entrepreneurs. I know I've done that in columns, who take this sometimes obsession with fixation on how each group is shortchanged, and they turn that, as entrepreneurs, they kind of turn that into a brand and a lament and a kind of entry into the public conversation that they use in discriminative circumstances in a way that erodes their credibility, allows the people who don't want to think about this stuff at all to tune out and say, oh, this is just all so much hooey. And the example I use in the book, because I think it's such a neat and tidy and clear one, was when Brittany Griner was horrifically imprisoned in Russia, right? A terrible thing, and thank God it's in the past. I was actually, and we were all aware of it, and everyone I knew was aware of it. I nonetheless saw things on social media and read things, by liberal writers, saying that Brittany Griner was languishing in Russia because nobody in America and nobody in the Biden administration cared about her because she's black, female, and lesbian, right? It is true that there is horrible racism in the world, that there's horrible sexism in the world, and that there's horrible homophobia. None of those things was dictating the amount of attention that Brittany Griner got. Right. I was more aware of everything that was going on with her, as was everyone around me, than of any other political prisoner I can think of in the last quarter century. Right. And I only learned about Paul Whelan, another political prisoner, because of her, and he's still there, right? I'm not saying she got too much attention, but I'm saying that when your brand, when your lament, when the way in which you get public attention is such that you graft that message, that complaint, onto everything, regardless of whether it grafts correctly onto that or not, and so many people do that in so many circumstances, you haven't enlightened anyone, you've corrupted public discourse to a point where you're actually working against. If your aim is really to end racism, sexism, homophobia, you have just acted against that, not in support of it, by making that claim in an indiscriminate and overwrought fashion.
My favorite one along those lines now is that the preamble many people use just in meetings or anywhere, or as a boom, okay, predict, insert your identity, and which is kind of a sly way of silencing anything that might any objection anyone might, and it seems like kind of it's been sort of weaponized now.
Yes, well, we've gone. This is another place where we've lost proportion and perspective, right? We rightly have recognized in recent years that we would have all sorts of discussions about injustices that existed and improvements that needed to be made, and that discussion would be being had by people who included none of the affected parties, right? Which was ridiculous. We have begun to take steps to amend that, and we've made progress in that regard. But again, sometimes this has gone to a point where if you are a white person, you're supposed to shut up about any sort of racial issue that affects black people because you can't understand. If you are a straight person, you're supposed to shut up about a gay matter because you can't understand. That's not tenable or constructive, because if I'm a gay man, if I'm asking you to understand me and then telling you you can't understand me, what the hell have I accomplished? And by the way,
nothing.
And by the way, we're constantly talking about the importance and the possibility of empathy.
Right.
To say that this person can't understand you because they stand outside of your categories is to deny the possibility of empathy entirely.
Right.
And again, it is a way of shutting conversations down and shutting people out. It is not inclusive, and it is not constructive.
Right. I sometimes put it that, even if you're not a mid-19th century Russian male, you can still read Tolstoy for profit.
Yes, when we praise a piece of literature, we talk correctly about how many people and how many different people can see themselves in the humanity of that character.
Yes.
Well, I mean, if we say no, if that character is this color, someone of another color can't understand it, and if it's this gender, et cetera, that's the opposite of that. In fact, what we learn from the greatest literature is how universal so many human aspirations and frustrations and dynamics are. Right. And that's human.
Right.
That's not by color, by gender, by creed, et cetera.
It's human, which gets to the point I was making earlier, just about how those other things, whether are just less salient in God's eyes. It goes much more to this thing.
Well, you know God a lot better than I do, so I'm gonna do it.
Okay. Let's see. Let's go to
in so many ways. Yeah.
Let's. But you know restaurants better than I do in New York.
Let's see, which is the better talent? Yeah.
In New York, restaurants.
Oh.
Restaurants. Boy. Okay, a couple of things. Let me see here. Oh, here's a nice one. I like this. How has this age of grievance affected you as a public figure?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think of myself as a public figure, so that's my first obstacle in answering
Brother.
it. It's affected me. It's affected me a bit as a journalist, in that I have tried too infrequently and imperfectly to adjust and to try to write occasionally and more often than I otherwise might about those people who I think are pushing back against it or represent another possibility. In a number of things I've written for the Times, in many pages of this book, I write about my fascination, for example, with governors who are of the political party different from the majority of their
mentioned that in the
state,
book. Yeah.
and how they govern and how we might learn from that. And there's a really interesting cast of them, and if you look at them, I wrote a whole long kind of essay about this for the opinion section a couple months ago, and as I said, some of this is in the book. But it's really interesting to look at the way those politicians govern and what they show us about leadership and about possibilities for healing. Right now, I would encourage everyone to pay a lot of attention, for example, to Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania. Now, he's not a different party than the majority of the state, but Pennsylvania is as purple can be, and he has terrific approval ratings. He won election as a Democrat there by margins that were much bigger than the ones that Fetterman or Joe Biden won the state by. And that's because if you look at he goes to great lengths and he's extremely disciplined about prioritizing and emphasizing the issues that he thinks resonate with and apply to the broadest diversity of people and the greatest number of people. This is that humanity over categories thing.
Yeah.
And I find,
talk about in the book, you talk about bread and butter issues too.
Yeah, and I talk about him. I talk about Charlie Baker when he was governor of Massachusetts. To cite two Republicans, Charlie Baker when he was governor of Massachusetts, Larry Hogan when he was governor of Maryland. They both constantly topped the list of governors with the highest approval ratings, and they were Republicans in probably, depending on how you measure it, the two bluest states in the country.
Right.
You know, look at Andy Beshear in Kentucky right now. Anyway, I have tried to pay more attention, both for myself and in journalism, to those people, because I think one of the things we have to do in the age of grievance is look for and toward people who might lead us to a better place.
How about this one? After today, are you hopeful at all about the future of our democracy? And what is the way forward? Which we'll come back to. But are you hopeful?
I'm cautiously hopeful. You know, I think for during too many periods and to an extent that we shouldn't, I think we take it for granted. I get frustrated when people say, "Well, you know, we've been through all this stuff and we're still standing and all that." You know, 200 what is it now? 250 whatever years is a mere blink in the eye of history. And so I think anyone who thinks, well, you know, we get through tough times, civil war, you know, the riots and the burning of cities in the 60s, this is nothing we haven't seen and nothing we can't transcend. I think that is, that could be fatally naive. How many people have seen the movie Nashville? Not that many. I recommend it highly. I think it's Robert Altman's best movie. It begins in a way that I think speaks to what I just said. There is a journalist for the BBC, I believe the character's name is Opal, and she's wandering around Nashville. It's the kind of introduction to the movie and to the city. And she stumbles upon a recording studio where the king of Nashville, I think the character's name is Haven Hamilton, is recording his new song. And the chorus of the song is, "We must be doing something right to last 200 years." And it's meant as a laugh line, and it should be meant as a laugh line. We should not take our democracy for granted because we're still damn young as a country.
Right. I'm going to take Jackson's privilege and go back to a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you to. Thank you all for your questions. They were excellent. Excellent. but I got him here, so yeah, I'm asking him. Okay, so couple of things. You have written and spoken about your blindness that you went through, the period that you went through. How did that experience affect how you look at these issues? Pardon the pun, but and has it?
No, it has. So yeah, in 2017, October 2017, I had a very rare kind of stroke of the optic nerve, and from that moment forward, I lost any useful vision in my right eye. And I saw seeing was a challenge for a while because my brain was adjusting from binocular to monocular vision. I was also told that when this happens, the underlying problems that my particular condition, the underlying problems that it signifies means that I live with a 20% chance of it happening in the other eye, which if it happened with the same severity would mean that I would be blind. Mm-hmm. So both in terms of kind of learning to see properly again, in terms of dealing with that sword of Damocles sort of hanging over me, it was an interesting emotional and medical odyssey for about 6 months to a year. And one of the things that I realized quickly was just what a dead end and how dangerous it was to kind of stew in what had been taken from me, to kind of obsess over what I'd lost and ways in which I'd been diminished, as opposed to all that remained. I sometimes, not sometimes, after that, when I looked at America, but I mean, I've been looking at these things too, I thought in some ways we are doing that, right? We're not just attending to the sorts of injustices I referred to before that one cannot and must not ignore, but we're clinging to slights and stewing in more minor misfortunes that we needn't. And that in the same way, my doing that regarding what I'd been through medically would have been very bad for my mental health. Right. We're doing it in a way that is very bad for our civic health. Yeah. I do see some connective tissue there. It's really, really imperfect and messy, but I think it did make me more sensitive to the idea of how much damage you do and what a trap you create when you insist on measuring meticulously all your misfortunes as opposed to integrating into that all of your blessings.
That's profound.
And I don't know about that, but...
No, it is. That is profound. We're at time. Are we?
It's so subtle the way it said time.
Yeah, right. So, Frank, they're going to get mad at me if I keep going, but I could keep going for another. Can I just ask one more?
Only if you first let me thank you for doing this, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
My final question is this: where do you find meaning?
I mean, in so many places. I find meaning in family. I have a brother here tonight. I come from a very close family. We have political differences. I don't mean my brother and I, although we probably have some, but not as many as we have with the other brother. But now we're not going to go down that road. No, but I mean, I come from a family where people do all sorts of things for their livings, where they vote in all sorts of ways, and we are extremely good, disciplined, high-minded, open-hearted about the fact that there are points of connection so much more important than any of that, and that there's a comfort and a strength that we find in one another that matters so much more than all those other differences. I find enormous meaning in that, and I think a lot of us do, and maybe it would be a good final note to say, you know, I was talking with students in a class I taught this spring about this very thing. Almost every student in the class came from a family where there were some people who had big disagreements with other people about political matters, about various issues. And yet, in most of these families, they could all sit down at the table. You know, let's use the cliche of Thanksgiving, and they could put those aside. They could put those aside. They could not think about those for a moment, and they could enjoy one another's company and warmth, and they could extend to everybody at that table a kind and a moment of grace. I think we need to learn to do that as the American family more than we do. If we can extend to family members with whom we disagree sharply about many things that sort of grace, why is it so hard to do that more often with our fellow citizens? I wish we'd ask ourselves that and act on it.
Frank Bruni.